Beyond the Gates spoilers, December 3rd. Love blossoms in Ted and Shanice's elevator. Key points. Shanice and Ted find themselves trapped in a potentially dangerous situation. Vernon and Joey don't mince words in their heated argument. Isaiah makes a bold move involving Eva. June's past gives Samantha an idea of her future. The morning at the hospital began like any other, with the flat crackle of announcements over the loudspeaker, the acrid tang of antiseptic hanging in the air, and the hurried footsteps of doctors and nurses racing up and down the corridors. But for Shanice, today felt strangely different, as if the air were heavier, the harsh neon lights brighter, and every keystroke, every squeak of gurney wheels on the tile floor jabbed at her already frayed nerves. She clutched a stack of files to her chest, walking while thinking about the endless demands from her superiors, the long shifts, the patients who never stopped needing something, and the invisible debts she carried, debts she never admitted to anyone. Just as her mind drifted too far into these thoughts, she collided with a tall figure turning the corner. The files flew out of her arms, papers scattering across the floor like a thin rain, exposing secrets that were supposed to remain hidden. The man was Ted. He instinctively bent down, reaching for the papers one by one, trying to stack them into a neat pile. In the moment when his hand brushed Shanice's, they both froze for half a second, not because of the exposed case numbers, but because of the unexpected jolt of touching the skin of a stranger who somehow made their hearts stutter. Shanice jerked her hand back, startled, while Ted realized his own heart had just skipped a beat. His eyes flicked over the information in the corner of one of the sheets. Data that was more than just work details, something that hinted at a connection to matters he was trying desperately to keep buried. She tried to steady herself, telling herself this was just a minor accident, yet unease rose within her. Annoyance at her own clumsiness mixed with anxiety that, in the chaos of that moment, something private might have slipped into the field of vision of the man standing in front of her. The two of them continued walking in the same direction, as if fate were deliberately herding them into a shared space. Shanice found herself grumbling about her boss pushing her to file yet another batch of forms. Meaningless paperwork dreamt up by people who had clearly never had to sprint between patient rooms. Behind the complaints simmered a bitter resentment at being treated like a paperwork machine, with no one caring how many hours of sleep she'd lost or how many lunches she'd gulped down in haste outside the break room. Ted listened and chuckled as if simply trying to lighten the mood, recalling how he had once seen his own superior fumbling to fax a PDF file. A scene that was as ridiculous as it was alarming, revealing how hopelessly out of touch and clumsy the hospital's decision-makers could be. But as he spoke, there was more than humor in his eyes. There was a darker edge, a contempt for the system, and a hint of bitterness from someone who understood all too well how power really worked in a place that pretended to be noble. They stepped into the elevator in a brief, shared silence, each sinking back into their own thoughts. The doors slid shut, a few seconds passed, and then the elevator shuddered and came to a halt. The lights cut out, leaving only a dim, ghostly glow mingled with the hiss of the ventilation system. Shanice stiffened at the all-too-familiar, unwelcome feeling. She had always believed this elevator was cursed. Every time someone mentioned being afraid of getting stuck, it seemed to grind to a stop as if on cue. It wasn't just superstition. It was a belief shaped by all the times she had been trapped between floors, heart pounding, sweat breaking out, childhood memories of being abandoned in the dark suddenly clawing their way back. She insisted she was just being cautious, but in her heart, the fear was real, almost a living phobia. Ted listened to her toss out what sounded like joking remarks about black cats, split telephone poles, and names that should never be repeated in front of a mirror, and he couldn't help prodding a little further, adding a few extra details, a few crooked half-smiles. He wanted to see where her limits were, to know whether she was the type to crumble or to fight back when pushed to the edge of her fear. Shanice tried to steady herself by filling the stalled time with bits of everyday biography. She spoke in an even voice, though her insides were anything but calm, saying she was the eldest of 5 children in a middle-class family. that her parents were still married, that they went to church every Sunday. These seemingly simple details were her way of reminding herself that she had roots, that she came from a stable starting point, that she wasn't some drifting, lost soul. She had almost become a ballet dancer, but an injury had severed that dream before it could fully take shape. Since then, every effort in her life had revolved around proving that she was still worth something, even if she no longer belonged on a stage. Inside her, a quiet rage had never disappeared, a rage at life for knocking her down without warning, and at herself for not being strong enough to fight back. She said she was afraid of nothing except birds, those creatures she saw as devils wrapped in bright feathers, especially owls with their unblinking eyes that seemed to pierce every secret, and parrots that dared to mimic human voices. In a way, what she really feared was being scrutinized, stripped bare, having her inner life exposed and repeated by someone else. Those private thoughts she would never dare say aloud. Ted grew quieter as he listened to these fragments of her story, but in his mind, it wasn't just simple sympathy. He realized this was the most honest conversation he'd ever had inside these hospital walls. Not because it was romantic, but because it revealed a person full of cracks, someone who could be exploited or could become an ally, if pressed at the right fault lines. He felt himself caught between two opposing pulls. On one side, the soft, rare sense of ease he felt standing next to Shanice, a sense that he might have a chance to start over with someone who didn't immediately judge him for his past. On the other side, the crushing weight of his shadowy agreements, the demands from forces outside the hospital. People who had no qualms about turning anyone into a pawn if it served their game at Fairmont Crest. He knew very little about Shanice, but what he had just heard was enough to let him calculate how she might react if the truth about him ever came out. About those files she had just dropped, about his recognition of a patient's name linked to a powerful family, about the scheme he was being forced into, even as some part of him still resisted. While the elevator hung suspended between floors, over at the food court in a nearby mall, Eva was trying to convince herself that this was just a light-hearted outing, a rare break after long hours of work. Isaiah appeared with the easy smile of a man who believed he could turn any situation to his advantage, leaning in to greet her with a kiss that left her more unsettled than pleased. He noticed the scent of her new lip gloss, complimented it as if it were the only detail on her face that existed, then joked with that arrogant confidence that he had nothing to be ashamed of and nothing to hide about who he was or what he'd done. On the surface, his words sounded like pure self-assurance. But to Eva, they rang more like a warning, that he wasn't afraid of being exposed because the secrets that really mattered had either been buried with someone else or were tangled up with people powerful enough that no one dared ask questions. Isaiah talked about how he had once been a threat, someone who could hurt others without a second thought, like a stray spark in a dry forest. Then he mentioned an accident that had nearly happened, and the person who had stepped in just in time to pull him back from the edge. As she listened, Eva felt her heart dip. What sounded like a boastful story brushed up against exactly what she had been trying to avoid: the identity of the person who saved him. It wasn't some nameless hero passing by, but a figure tied to power, contracts, promises, and debts that were almost impossible to repay in their community. Eva knew this all too well, because she had watched that very person use the act of saving a life as a chain, to bind, manipulate, and turn survivors into lifelong debtors. Isaiah recounted it with the pride of someone grateful for a second chance, but what Eva heard was the clink of chains, invisible links pulling him back into a game he did not fully understand. He spoke of an amazing plan for their next date, of wanting to see who she really was, stripped of the edited version she allowed the world to see. Eva felt her skin tighten, as if every muscle in her body had to hold the mask in place so it wouldn't crack. She was drawn to his intensity, to the idea that someone might actually want to see the truest parts of her. But at the same time, memories of her last relationship, where trust had been turned into a weapon, came crashing back like cold waves. She had once opened herself up, once believed she had been seen and loved, only to realize she'd been nothing more than a means to an end, left behind in the mocking gaze of Fairmont Crest. From that point on, her anger at herself for being so trusting, and at the system that protected the one who hurt her, had never really faded. When Ted called, his voice in her ear carried the urgency of a man who just stepped into dangerous territory. He said he was in trouble and needed her to postpone some of their counseling sessions. To outsiders, it would sound like nothing more than a scheduling adjustment. But to Eva, the fact that someone like Ted, a man who was always careful about his image, who kept every detail in order, admitted he was in trouble was a clear sign that something in the system was beginning to crack. She seized on that as a reason to tell Isaiah that their date would have to end early. That work was calling. The truth was, part of her wanted to flee from the comforting warmth of the food court, because it made her soft at a time when she needed to be hard to keep moving forward with her plans. Eva pretended to be busy with calls, as if she were genuinely trying to untangle some urgent professional problem. But deep down, she knew she was using work as a shield. She did like Isaiah, that was undeniable. She liked the way he looked at her as a woman, not as a broken piece in the complicated machinery of Fairmont Crest. Yet she had been wounded too deeply to let herself slide easily into feeling again. In some shadowed corner of her mind, she recognized that this closeness could also become a tool, an advantage in the quiet war she was waging to flip the balance of power and challenge the force that had trampled over her and so many others in the community. Her promise that the wait would be worth it, sealed with the kiss she gave him before leaving, was both a commitment and an anchor. She wanted him to stay tethered there, still trusting, still waiting so she could keep control. She didn't know how much of her heart was sincere and how much was calculated. There were nights when she asked herself whether she was turning into the very kind of person she had once despised. Someone who knew how to pin another person between hope and deprivation, who used delay as a form of control. But when she remembered the insults, the parties where people laughed in her face and toyed with her nickname, the unjust decisions that had pressed down on her life, the pangs of guilt inside her were drowned out by a slow, smoldering fury. If she wanted to shift the balance of power, sometimes she would have to wield the same weapons that had once been used against her. She wasn't sure she was ready to pay the price for that path, but with each step, it felt like she was pulling a layer of armor back around herself. Isaiah stayed behind with a lingering aftertaste of confusion. He was drawn to her complexity, to the empty spaces he couldn't seem to fill with his smile or his stories. Yet beneath his eagerness to win her over, a vague unease had taken root. He realized she always kept a part of herself just out of reach, as if weighing him not only as a potential lover, but also as a piece on a much larger board. He hadn't forgotten the one who had saved him from that accident, nor the reminders that he owed an unspoken, unpayable debt. He had no idea that this very tie was what made Eva hesitate, because she knew his savior was also the one holding too many strings in the community, including her own. Back in the elevator, the lights flickered back on with a faint sound, and the system grudgingly resumed its motion. By the time the doors slid open, several layers of information and silent observation had accumulated between Shanice and Ted. Shanice reassured herself that she had only shared to ease the tension, but deep down, she was angry with herself for revealing so much to a man she barely knew. She was expected to set an example and protect her parents' reputation. She had learned to hide her exhaustion, to chart her life in a way that no one could accuse her of being selfish. Yet the more she tried to maintain that spotless image, the more she felt a building pressure inside her. A trapped anger with nowhere to go, a fear that she might one day shatter under the weight of always having to be strong. As for Ted, when the doors opened, he felt a fleeting impulse to start taking the stairs from now on. Not just out of superstition, but because he could feel how easily he became unsettled in closed spaces like this. He wasn't sure if the concern he felt for Shanice was genuine or just a reaction from a lonely man looking for something to cling to amid dangerous arrangements. He knew he was edging toward a line that would be hard to justify. Either continue serving as a pawn for the very forces he had once sworn he would never resemble, or resist and be crushed. His call asking Eva to delay their sessions wasn't only about his busy schedule. It was born of fear that if he let anyone probe deeper, The last layers of his armor would fall away and he'd be exposed as a coward, someone who wanted to move in the shadows while still yearning for an escape. Shanice stepped out of the elevator, vowing to avoid it from now on if she could, the same way she avoided any situation where she might lose control. Ted followed her out, carrying with him a new burden, the awareness of a woman who had accidentally revealed her inner fractures. Eva walked away from the food court, leaving behind a man waiting for her, not knowing whether he was slowly becoming a hostage to a larger scheme. Isaiah sat amid the smells of food and the din of voices, feeling strangely unsettled as he realized he had proudly talked about the favor that saved his life, unknowingly dragging old chains back into the light, chains he thought had rusted away. All of them, each in a different place, carried unnamed anger and unspoken choices in their hearts. None of them knew that invisible threads were slowly binding them into the same web of schemes and struggles where personal wounds could be turned into fuel for larger battles, and the seemingly small decisions they made today would determine whether they became survivors, traitors, or just the next victims in a power game where no one was ever truly innocent.